So, in this presentation I would be focusing on the social and environmental implications of the Farakka barrage project. Mainly I would be focusing on the West Bengal scenario, but before we go to the West Bengal scenario, it is also important for us to understand that, as I had mentioned in my previous lecture, that Farakka had been a bone of contention between these two countries, India and Bangladesh. And Bangladesh being located at the downstream of the project, it had suffered a lot. So, like this is a particular snapshot from Mirza, which shows the complex impact of the Farakka barrage on the environment or the riverine topography and environmental dimensions of this particular nation, the downstream nation Bangladesh. Now, if I just narrate in simple terms, then I mean there is a particular river, a distributary of the Ganges, which is called the Gorai, and to a great extent the economy of Bangladesh, more importantly agriculture, is dependent on the flow of the Garai river, because the Garai is connected to the Ganges and it draws water, as it is connected to the Ganges. So, it brings Ganges water and it I mean to mainly the southwestern part of the nation of Bangladesh. But due to the construction of the Farakka barrage, due to water diversion, the discharge of the Garai river to a great extent had been highly affected. So, what happens is that during the winter season there is drought, because Bangladesh gets reduced flow during that time. On the other hand, during the monsoon it is peak discharge, and that leads to floods and flood hazards in Bangladesh. So, it is affected or it suffers from both droughts and floods due to this water diversion scheme. And experts, they argue that if this continues like this, then maybe whether the Gorai would exist in the future, that is a big question. So, so this is a little bit about Bangladesh, but then now if we move on to what is happening so far as India is concerned, more specifically West Bengal is concerned, we need to understand that the social impact, the environmental impact of Farakka barrage had really not been very beneficial or positive so far as the Indian counterpart is also concerned. Because we discussed in the in our lecture on multipurpose riverway development schemes, that how Nehru began with this inaugural speech that dams are the temples of modern India, but at the same so the element or the component of national glory and national pride were associated with construction of barrages and dams. But at the same time, if you take a minute look, if we really make some social impact assessment, if we are concerned, if we are aware of the environmental impacts, then we will see that how this project, it I mean it is really questionable, it is really doubtful whether we would be able to categorize this, or whether we would be able to project this as our national pride or national glory, because data shows very sharply, data shows that during the post implementation phase, riverine bank erosion in both Malda, that is the upstream of the Farakka barrage, and Murshidabad, that is the downstream of the Farakka barrage, had increased tremendously. And so, as I mentioned that I did some field work in both Malda and Murshidabad, in the villages, in the Chor villages, the riverine island villages of Malda and Murshidabad, and I also could consult some data, some secondary data, some statistics on riverbank erosion, and I found out that really riverbank erosion in Malda and Murshidabad had increased during the post implementation phase. So, I could come up with an occasional paper which was published in 2011, and there I had from some of the very important secondary sources, I had shown that how, for example, this table provides information about left bank erosion by the Ganges in the Malda district. And if you consider these years, you see how erosion has really increased. And it also talks about it provides statistics and data about loss of land. So, loss of land, loss of fertile land, these are fertile lands. So, loss of fertile lands in Malda, and this is again a map that shows how the river has migrated, how the river has shifted during the post implementation period, and leading to the rise of the increase in the rise of riverine islands, again an issue which we will focus right now. And so, this is about Malda, but not only Malda, in Murshidabad also, again if we take a look into this table, it talks about land loss and population displacement. So, displacement and eviction are other important aspects or issues that are highly associated with the construction of different dam projects, including Farakka. So, so we can see that how people had lost land and how people had become, I mean people had been displaced and evicted from their original habitat. And so, we can see that how between 1988 and 1994, again data by Kalyan Rudra, it shows it provides data on erosion of land in square kilometers, number of families affected, and also population displaced, including projected population. So, we can see that it is not only problematic for Bangladesh, but it is also problematic for people living in Malda and Murshidabad. Now, I will come to another very important and delicate issue, which is the riverine islands. So, riverine islands, which are known as chors in the local dialect, the formation of chors and the existence of chors is very common in tropical deltaic estuarine contexts and spaces or locations. So, chor formation is a part and parcel, integral part and parcel of of areas which are deltaic, which are estuarine, which are mainly which mainly encounter the lower course of a particular river. So, as we are discussing the lower Gangetic basin, which is deltaic, so chor formation is nothing new in this area. And so, this is validated by historical evidences and historical reports, colonial gazetteers and other publications which talk about the formation and existence of these chors since time immemorial. So, for example, in Malda there is a big chor with a very long history, which is known as the Bhutni Diyar. But then why am I focusing on chors while I am discussing Farakka? Because Farakka barrage project and formation of chor has a kind of a complex and direct relationship, because we have seen that due to the construction of the Farakka barrage, there has been a massive change and transformation in the nature of chor formation. This is a very important point. So, their chors were there since time immemorial, but what had happened is that there has been a change in the nature and pattern of chor formation since the construction of the barrage, because we remember that it is a huge and a massive project with like 112 log gates and other concrete structures. So, what has happened is that it has disrupted the natural flow of the river. It has disrupted, and by doing so it has disrupted the entire equilibrium of the area. So, what has happened is that now when the river moves through the barrage, so there are disruptions like the massive pillars, the log gates that you remember. So, what has happened is that silt get accumulated on the backside of these pillars, and so there has been a rise in the bed level of the river, and this has increased the siltation and the erosion and sedimentation in both upstream and downstream of the barrage. So, I would not go into the technical details of how the bed level has increased and how that has affected or that has increased the sedimentation and erosion of the river, because any hydrologist or any technical person on doing research on water, or maybe any physical geographer will be able to shed lot of limelight in on these aspects in these areas, but my concern would be, I would be more interested to make the water society connection, to make the river society connection, and to show that, I mean, how people are to a great extent suffering in these regions, but at the same time how they had also been able to come up with coping strategies. So, to a great extent they are highly resilient in the chores. So, what I would be sharing is their life stories and the life realities encountered by the so called Choruas, again Chorua in the local dialect, which means people inhabiting the riverine islands. So, this is the SDRR syndrome, which means settlement displacement, resettlement, redisplacement due to the emergence, submergence, re-emergence and re-submergence of chores. So, as I just shared right now, that there is a direct relationship between chore formation and the construction of the Farakka barrage, because Farakka had affected the nature and pattern of chore formation. So, previously we had these permanent chores, because I gave the example of for example Bhutni Diara in Malda. So, which had a long history of 300, 400, 500 years, and from official colonial reports we find that even revenue was generated from these chores like Bhutni Diara, because these were tremendously fertile. But now what happened is that due to the construction of the Farakka, the chores are forming, the riverine islands are forming at the stretch of the river, but at the same time these chores, their pattern has transformed in the sense that these chores have become from permanent to temporary chores. Okay. So, what had happened is that these chores would be there, would exist for maybe 5 to 10 years, and then after a particular point of time they would get submerged, and then maybe 5 kilometers ahead there would be the formation of another chore. So, what would happen is that due to the continuous emergence, submergence, re-emergence and resubmergence of chore, there is this particular syndrome of settlement, displacement, resettlement and redisplacement of the inhabitants living in both Malda and Murshidabad district. So, people who would lose their land in the mainland, for example, in I can give a concrete example from a particular area called Ponchanandapur in Malda. So, what happened is that during the late 1970s there was massive erosion in Ponchanandapur, and so people lost their homes, fertile lands. So, huge loss of land, hectares and acres of land, and finally what happened is that they had to move to the newly emerged chores in the midst of rivers. So, what happened is that they lost their citizenship because they lost their all the important documents, ration cards, they lost their lands, homes, everything. And then what happened is that after 5 years they again had to migrate from another chore, because the old chore where they initially settled when their homes got submerged inside the river. So, that chore also got submerged, and they had no other option but to migrate and settle to the new chore. So, I have seen how people in the last in the last maybe 15 years they had migrated between 4 to 16 times from one chore to the other. And so, we can see that there are numerous problems due to this continuous migration. So, economic problems due to erosion, so loss of occupation. So, previously they were agriculturists, but then no more they are agriculturists who actually pay revenue to the state. So, loss of land of course associated with this, depression in wage levels, loss of property. So, the political problem of statelessness and denial of Article 21, which is the right to live, because like there is no infrastructural intervention from the part of the state. So, I mean for example, drinking water supply or sanitation or other educational facilities or the functioning of different schemes by the government, these actually do not exist in these areas because they are not recognized as revenue villages, and these are not recognized and as part and parcel of the state. So, but there is this huge problem of statelessness and loss of citizenship rights, and from there of course loss of identity and all that. And again the connect or the overlapping relationship between the political and the social. So, we had discussed displacement and eviction in these areas, relating to which is these identity crisis, and also whole lot of criminal activities in these areas, because they have porous borders. So, we will discuss that how few chores which are sometimes readily accessible from Bangladesh, but on the other hand from the mainland Malda or mainland Murshidabad, it is very difficult to access this chore within a few hours. So, it takes a longer time to access these chores from the Indian counterpart or from the West Bengal counterpart, but it is easily accessible from Bangladesh maybe within 45 minutes. So, there are these issues, transboundary issues, and due to which many other illegal activities like human trafficking, animal trafficking are very prominent in these regions. So, health, sanitation, education problems are of course there, because as I mentioned that no government amenities or facilities exist in these regions, areas. So, this is a picture from one of the chores in Malda. So, as I was discussing interstate and intrastate issue. So, this is an interstate issue, an issue between the West Bengal state government and the Jharkhand state government. So, one particular chore called the Hamidpur chore, it has a very interesting and a long history, as I talked about also the erosion in Panchanandapur during the 1970s, and how people lost their homes, their land, and finally migrated to a newly emerged chore which they named Hamidpur, and it is a very interesting nomenclature in the sense that previously the village in which they used to stay in mainland Malda, the name of the village was Hamidpur. So, though the space was different, but they they were carrying the nomenclature, they were carrying the name of their particular village wherever they were migrating. So, there was really some confusion when I was little bit doing a kind of an ethnographic study. So, every time they were saying Hamidpur. So, what happened, they said that like when the Hamidpur village got submerged, then we shifted to Hamidpur, and then after 5 years again we shifted in another area which was 10 kilometers from Hamidpur, and then we remained in Hamidpur for the next 10 years. So, it was very confusing, but then I got to know that it was in their memory. So, it was not basically a kind of a geographical space, but it was a name in the mental space. So, and this is an interesting story of a particular man who was the moral or the village headman of Hamidpur when Hamidpur was there in mainland Malda, but after that when the families shifted, they started shifting from one chore to the other, this man was still the moral or the village headman of the of Hamidpur, and so he shows a voter card which had been issued to him by the Jharkhand government, and the ration card, an old ration card which was already there with him, which had been issued by the government of West Bengal. So, sometimes what we find is that there is statelessness or lack and loss of citizenship right, but on the other hand we also find this contrast of dual citizenship, because what happened is that the West Bengal government was not interested to consider these chores as revenue villages. So, but at the on the other hand these areas were extremely fertile. So, Jharkhand thought that it was quite lucrative for the Jharkhand government to give them a voters card, so that Jharkhand can actually acquire these fertile patches. So, it was a political decision on part of the Jharkhand government, and so finally these people to a great extent they were convinced and mobilized, and Jharkhand government issued like roughly 500-600 voters card to these people. And so, there was utter confusion, but after a particular point of time they protested and said that see, we are Bengali speaking population and we do not want to come under the Jharkhand government. We are fine with even loss of citizenship right or statelessness, but we do not want to get attached to Jharkhand government. So, what happened is that it drew a lot of attention from the media and also from the NGOs and grassroots organization like GBPNC, which is Ganga Bhangon Action Protirod Nagorik Committee, and also NGOs like CRY, Child Rights and You, and finally to a great extent they were mobilized by these grassroots organizations and non-government organizations, and Hamidpur is a success story because finally they fought a battle, and finally in 2010-11 around 713 voters card were issued to the inhabitants of Hamidpur. So, we did some detailed research on Hamidpur, and because it is one of the best examples or best case study or illustration to show that how you can also fight in these chores and how you can also bring a change and make the state government officials feel that if some protection can be provided to these inhabitants, then the state can only reap the long term benefits. So, this is again so we that was the so Hamidpur basically it was a kind of a intrastate boundary I mean illustration of an intrastate boundary problem. So, there are other dimensions also, for example, as I mentioned, interstate boundary problem. So, boundary problem with Bangladesh. So, this is again one particular chore called the Nirmal chore just which emerged near Akhiriganj. So, Akhiriganj it is a location within the within Murshidabad district, and again it has an interesting story how in the late 1970s and 80s how these how there was a whole lot of erosion in this particular area. So, Akhiriganj, which also virtually means the last site or the last settled site or the last settlement, how it totally got disappeared from the map of Murshidabad, and finally how after few years Nirmal chore emerged in the middle of the river. And so, as I was mentioning that Nirmal chore it can be accessed by the Rajshahi district of Bangladesh within 45 minutes. But on the other hand it can be accessed from Murshidabad only I mean it takes at least 3 to 4 hours to get to Nirmal chore from West Bengal, from Murshidabad. So, there is this question and issue of Bangladeshi infiltration and infiltration by Bangladeshi cultivators in this area, which is to a great extent illegal, but at the same time as the boundary is so porous. So, it is very difficult for government officials to come up with standardized notions of so called legality and illegality. So, finally, what we could observe or what we could understand was that instead of so many problems, if you remember the diagram SDRR and the other problems coming from it. So, I mean the block development officers or other people, people even from the academic circle, they often ask us that I mean why are we so interested about chore, and why do we keep emphasizing on lives and livelihoods and vulnerabilities and resilience in these chores, because finally these are still these are fluid spaces, and one day they will get submerged, and even it is not very wise to ask the government to come up with infrastructural intervention. Okay, because if for example government constructs a school, or if the government constructs I mean a hospital for that matter, so there is no guarantee that that would remain, because maybe after 2-3 years the entire chore would get submerged. So, this so I mean it is not economically viable. But then I mean we would argue to a great extent that this is basically I mean non-infrastructural intervention is a kind of a I mean it is a strategy to legitimize the illegality, or to legitimize the very fact that the government is not really interested with the lives and livelihoods of these inhabitants who are called Chauras. Because we have to keep this in mind that these people, They once had homes, they once had property, they once had everything in the mainland, and it has been proved scientifically that during the post implementation phase, due to the construction of the Farakka barrage to a great extent, these people, they had suffered floods and erosions and hazard. So, I mean, the whole question is, the state really, I mean, does not the state really need to think about the lives and livelihoods of these people who were once part and parcel of the state, who once had voters' rights, who were once voters of the state. So, they had identity, but now due to erosion, due to floods, due to the complex problems in during the post implementation phase of the Farakka barrage, they had become choruas, they have become detached from the mainland livelihood and from the mainland culture. But finally, what we would like to argue and emphasize is that life still rolls on in these chores, because what are the incentives that attract and draw the choruas to these otherwise dynamic and volatile spaces is that these areas, they are thickly, I mean, they are very fruitful in terms of ecosystem resource and in terms of ecosystem services. So, all these services like the provisioning services, the regulating services, the cultural services, these are very much there, these exist in these fertile areas, and so the people, they can easily make their livelihoods from this. So, they do not have to invest much. So, in order to carry on agricultural occupation, they really do not need to invest, and we have seen that how jute or for that matter rice, these are flourishing business in the chores of both Malda and Murshidabad. So, if the government can really step in, if the government can really move forward and at least provide some so called accompanying measures. So, we are using this particular term called accompanying measures. So, if the government can really come up with some accompanying measures to facilitate the coping strategies that these people had already devised, then I think that can mean a lot, and that can bring a lot of change in the lives and livelihoods of these people. So, so with this, what I really wanted to highlight in this presentation was that it is not only important for us to understand a particular barrage project or a dam or a public infrastructure from only the technical point of view. It is also important for us to take into account the complex social, political, cultural, more importantly also environmental nitty-gritties or environmental aspects that are thickly loaded with the implementation of big infrastructure projects on rivers and water bodies. So, these are some of the important references. Thank you.